So we'll start on time. We welcome you to this special session, public session of Ananta Aspen on China-Pakistan relations. We are very happy to have with us Andrew Small. He is a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, which he established in 2006. He previously worked as director of the Foreign Policy Center Beijing office, as a visiting fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and was an ESU scholar in the office of Senator Edward Kennedy. His articles have been published in different newspapers, including the New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and Washington Quarter. But more importantly for today, he is the author of The China-Pakistan Axis, Asia's New Geopolitics. This book came up in early 2015, and a new edition, the London edition, has come in December 2015. So we will discuss this book today and the subject. What we are going to do is, Andrew and I are going to have a conversation on the book for some time, and then I will ask him to speak for a short while if something is missing, and more importantly, we'll leave a large amount of time for a discussion between the audience and him, especially as I see many knowledgeable people here in the gathering. So that's how we, so welcome, Andrew. And you know, this subject is of great importance, and what you have written, to many of us in India, these were known facts. But the thing that you have brought them together in one book is very important and interesting. So I congratulate you on a very well-researched book, and he's covered different aspects of the relationship, the nuclear, the India factor, the jihad and how it has been used by both the countries, and the interplay between India, Russia, and other countries in this relationship. Well, you know, the first thing that comes to my mind on reading this book, I read this book a year ago, and was the strategic aspect. You have emphasized the strategic importance of this relationship. At the same time, you have been careful to mention that this is a defense partnership without a treaty. And somewhere you have mentioned that in spite of the fact that there is no treaty, yet this is a relationship which is more important than many countries which have a treaty. You have also mentioned that on 3 occasions, Pakistan did ask for a defense treaty, twice Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in the 70s, and then Gilani in 2012. Well, I want you to tell us something about the strategic part of it first, and the strategic underpinnings that we have briefly talked, if you could.
Absolutely, and thanks very much for the kind introduction, Ambassador, and delighted to be here, and thanks for coming along to this, and looking forward to your thoughts on this subject as well. I think you framed it very well in terms of the long-term strategic dimension of the relationship between China and Pakistan. It's always been a security partnership that is short of an alliance, but where the level of military and intelligence cooperation between the two sides, and particularly on areas of such high sensitivity, has, as you noted, I think built a partnership that in many respects runs closer than certain formal treaty alliances. China has always been cautious not to accept the liabilities that would ensue to them if they were to take on formal defense commitments. And of course, aside from the long-term non-aligned principles that China has held to on this, the early phase of the relationship, the phase of the relationship that really formed what has subsequently been called this all-weather friendship, was one in which there was a standing question at a series of different junctures about whether China would intervene in wars on Pakistan's behalf. And I think you have to see the relationship really emerging out of several of these wars in the 60s and 70s, and then how China's reacted to that, and the way that it's conditioned the relationship in the aftermath. Because I think 62 is the first point at which you get this sense for both countries of the potential utility of cooperation vis-a-vis India on the strategic front. You first get not just the sense of the value of India having the two fronts to be concerned about simultaneously, but the idea that there are disadvantages that may accrue if the two sides are not coordinated. You get the border settlement very quickly after the 62 war. But then it's really 65, which is the first point at which you get this real prospect of Chinese intervention on Pakistan's behalf. And in the book, where kind of looked into some of the archives on the Chinese side as well, I think even more so than had been fully understood, there was a real prospect of Chinese intervention in 65. But 65 also illustrated the fact that despite having India as this common frame of reference, and the fact that this relationship has been an India-centric relationship really for a very long time, the two sides came from very different military cultures and had very different expectations about how they should think about tactics and strategy vis-a-vis India. There's an anecdote from 1965 where Ayub Khan pays his secret visit to Beijing and is told by Zhou Enlai and Chen Yi, you should, if necessary, retreat to the hills and prepare for guerrilla warfare, even if a few major cities are lost. And this is so alien to the thinking on the Pakistani side at this time that Ayub Khan goes home disappointed. And so this conception even of China being with Pakistan, because he was also given this assurance, we will be with you through to the end on this, but you will have to sit this out. I think the different conception of how the two sides have thought about this has always been rooted in the relationship. And then, of course, in 71, China is not willing to intervene despite a strong push both by the Americans and by the Pakistanis to do so. And what you really get after 1971, although this question of the two-front war, although you have this important dimension that's there of Pakistan playing this counterbalancing role for China in the region, you really have something that looks a little bit more like a large-scale procurement relationship. China wants to ensure that Pakistan has the capabilities it needs to play the role that China wants it to. But when it comes to actual crises, China is not necessarily going to be there to swing in on Pakistan's behalf. And I think you have a number of junctures afterwards where this is well understood, that there are limits to China's willingness to back Pakistan up on this. But when it comes to long-term factors, the building of Pakistan's strategic capabilities, and most critically, of course, on the nuclear front and on the ballistic missile front, where China plays this absolutely vital role in the success of Pakistan's nuclear program and essentially establishes its missile program pretty much from scratch, and helps Pakistan as well to develop its indigenous capabilities to produce a lot of these forms of equipment. And that becomes the sort of strategic frame that's there for a long time. China will provide this backing, largely militarily, but largely through support to Pakistan's capabilities, rather than necessarily backing Pakistan up in live war scenarios. And you see this tested out again and again. You see it in Kargil. You see it in a very different context in the aftermath of Abbottabad. There are a number of junctures that are crisis junctures where China sees Pakistan as having brought the problems on itself and is not necessarily willing to swing in behind it, but is continually willing to provide the forms of military cooperation that Pakistan requires. And I think we'll get into, I think we're now entering into a very different phase of the relationship. And this has always been a relationship that is heavily security-based, heavily conditioned by a relationship by the militaries on the two sides. And we are now, I think, entering finally into a phase where the other legs of the relationship, the very weakest leg, the economic leg, may finally be coming into existence, because it was so very weak before. But I'll leave that there.
Well, yes, I think that brings me to what you mentioned on the India-centric part of it. But before that, you have in the book mentioned the limitations to the strategic aspect, because China did not intervene in 71, as you said. The feeling here is that China's policy towards India has been trying to restrict India to the subcontinent, to South Asia, create trouble for India in India and in the neighborhood, and that is what brings us to this relationship. You have mentioned the India-centric part of the China-Pakistan relationship. In the book, you mentioned the managed mistrust. You say that when you use the word managed mistrust, that China would like the relations between India and Pakistan to be the same as between India and China. Are you saying that they do not want a reconciliation between India and Pakistan? And that aspect and the India-centric part, if you can briefly mention, then we will move to other aspects, because we within the time frame.
Yep. So briefly on that, yes, I think China has seen Pakistan partly as a counterbalance, but also as a source of constraint for India, and has been, even though not necessarily directly supportive of all of the aspects that Pakistan, but by which Pakistan has pursued some of these things against India, has basically been the backdrop enabling factor for a lot of that, has provided political cover, has provided a whole series of things in addition to the military capabilities themselves. But yes, I think China has encouraged Pakistan to have a relationship that resembles its own relationship with India in two respects. First of all, China thinks that Pakistan should benefit economically from its relationship with India in the same way that China does. I think it sees the capacity for strategic competition, even strategic rivalry, coexisting with economic cooperation that, of course, China not only has with India, but, say, with the United States. And it thinks Pakistan is disadvantaged by the fact that that doesn't exist. And secondly, the managed mistrust, I think, is important. I think they don't want nasty surprises. I think they want the relationship to exist within a degree of careful management, predictability, again, in the way that I think they see their own relationship with India having evolved. And so in that respect, and continuing to this day, this is still what China urges on Pakistan for the bilateral relationship with India. But they have benefited from the fact that India, they see in certain respects over a number of years being tied down on its western borders by the relationship with Pakistan. So to your question, is there a sort of fulsome reconciliation that China would like to see? I think since that's not sufficiently on the cards, I don't think they've had to trouble themselves with this. But there is a state of mistrust that I think China sees as existing as a benefit for them in the bilateral relationship as well.
You know, Andrew Small in his book has referred to various aspects which he has called the ultimate gift from China to Pakistan. And shortage of time, I am not going to touch in my brief discussion on the main gift, the nuclear and other aspects. They are very well known to us. So I will move to the weak link that you mentioned, the China-Pakistan economic corridor. As we understand it, this is a 15-year arrangement. It's supposed to involve about $46 billion. The general feeling is that it's a gift, whereas the chairman of the Pakistan State Bank has himself mentioned that he's not sure if it is debt, equity, or kind. So what about us, even if he says there should be transparency? And as I think you yourself have mentioned this in your book. Now, where does this stand? We understand that out of this 46 billion, about 35 are supposed to be for power projects and 10 for infrastructure. In some aspect that I have read on the agreements which were signed. Figures vary, but where do you think does this stand, this corridor? And is it really as great as it looks, or is it imaginary?
So, I mean, for context on the economic relationship, this has always been extraordinarily weak by any comparative framework that you would look at it, whether on trade or investment terms. And we have had, in the past, these sorts of large-scale numbers thrown around before. I think the estimate was that between 2001 and 2011, you could add up about $66 billion worth of financial support of various sorts that China had pledged, of which about 6% of it actually came through in various forms. So I think there have been plenty of grounds for skepticism going into the CPEC project. But I think the context for CPEC is different from the previous context for economic cooperation between the two sides. First of all, I mean, I think the overall figure is actually very hard to pin down. When Xi Jinping went to visit, there were about $28 billion worth of deals that had been agreed. This $46 billion figure has stuck and continues to be referred to on the Pakistani side, and was a number that first came from the Pakistani government. In practice, I think it's a figure that's in considerable flux. It's more of a process than a fixed package in certain respects. I think you can add up all of the different elements, and I think that was a fair framing of it in terms of the relative proportion of the energy projects, relative proportion of infrastructure, but this is a rolling process in a sense. There are a number of projects, even from that $46 billion, that have already been put on ice. There are a number of new ones that have been added to that. But the difference between this and the previous projects, or the previous form by which economic cooperation took place between the two sides, was that previously, when China and Pakistan would run into obstacles on their economic cooperation, whether they were security or just the ordinary commercial obstacles, government incapacity, a whole series of different things, they tended to be used as an excuse by China to slow the project down or to stop it altogether. Now the dynamic is different. The political support for this project is of a qualitatively different level and comes from the very top levels. It's really conceived more as a strategic project than necessarily a purely economic one in nature, though there are a number of economic benefits that are expected to accrue to the specific Chinese companies that are involved. I think a lot of the internal estimates on the Chinese side are still quite pessimistic, whether it comes to the security dimensions or the commercial benefits that may accrue from it. I think what you have is a very large package of different potential projects that have been assembled, of which some of them will stick, some of them will fail, and I think we're already seeing a few of the projects that are being put on ice or rolled over. The challenge at the moment is really one of implementation. There are, in the initial phase, and I mean the ambitions for the initial phase are not spectacular. The early harvest phase leading through to the next Pakistani elections is really about adding a few thousand megawatts of power to the grid, finishing up the next phase of Gwadar, getting some of the roads done, this sort of thing. The next phase, the next 5 years, I think, looks somewhat more ambitious. But there have been a lot of struggles internally that China's faced in Pakistan, I think, have surprised them, because they're used to having this very broad base of support. The way the project's been implemented in practice, though, has been quite heavily centered around the PMLN and the current Pakistani government. The pressure that's there at the moment is to have something that looks more like a sort of national consensus type entity driving the project, which means two things. One, having a larger role for the Pakistani military in the implementation, and secondly, having a larger role for the other provinces, rather than this just being run by the PMLN and certain specific people there. So I think elements of the project will come off, but I think at the moment the very inflated expectations that are there for it will probably fall short. But I think, to reiterate, this is really being pushed ahead very actively on the Chinese side. The previous dynamic used to be Pakistan going to China and asking for these projects, and for China being unwillingly rolling along with them. The dynamic in this instance is China is pushing for these things to happen faster, and this CPEC has ended up really being, in the scheme of this broader plan that China has, the Belt and Road Initiative, it's ended up being really the only fully realized part of this entire scheme. And so what it's ended up translating into is basically a test case for the entire Silk Road economic belt and maritime Silk Road. So it means the political premium attached to success for the entire Belt and Road scheme and for Xi Jinping personally is higher than I think China had probably intended when the thing was put together in the first place. But it means that I think the urge to overcome these obstacles is far higher than it ever was before, and I do expect at least a portion of these projects to come off and be realized in the coming stretch.
I must correct myself that reference of the governor of the State Bank of Pakistan was not in your book, but that was in an article by an Indian scholar on the. You know, you mentioned the strategic and economic aspect and the early harvest. But if we look at the route which was originally followed for that was from Kashgar coming down to Dera Ismail Khan and then to Gwadar. But Dera Ismail Khan has now been cut out. It's all through Punjab now. So that is the strategic part, and economically that would make it longer and more difficult.
So the way China has been concerned, I think, about the degree to which this project is being painted as a literal corridor, a transit corridor. What they've tried to stress with it is that, I mean, the line that you sometimes get is all of Pakistan is a corridor. The aim with some of these, the aim is to have multiple routes, to have benefits accrue to multiple provinces, and really I think the underlying intention on China's part, the transit dimension of it I think is pushed more on the Pakistani side. On the Chinese side, the aim has been to provide some level of impetus for the Pakistani economy and of course for benefits for Chinese companies in the process as well. But the aim has been to put a large-scale strategic investment in place that will address what I think are some of China's concerns about the direction in which Pakistan was headed and some of the weaknesses that it saw there that translate not just in economic terms but in security terms for them as well. And even when it comes back to this basic role that they want Pakistan to play in the region, I think they see Pakistan falling behind, they see Pakistan more fragile than they would like, they see Pakistan without the financing capacity to do certain things they would like to see it do. And a lot of the thrust of CPEC has been to bolster Pakistan through this rather than necessarily to have specific transit routes going through Baluchistan. I still think a lot of the transit elements are incredibly difficult. I mean, just for logistical reasons. The KKH, moving goods up and down the KKH, given the natural disasters that are there, the road is still routinely closed, even with all the expansion and the new tunnels that have been put in to protect it from landslides and things. I think the commercial questions around the viability of this as a consistently useful route have not gone away, whatever the political salience of the scheme. But I think the success of it will be contingent more on whether they're able to bolster the Pakistani economy in the process than necessarily whether they're able to fully pull off Gwadar as a functioning port and really have active transit taking place between Xinjiang and the Indian Ocean.
My impression from the media of the two countries is that in Pakistan, a great importance is given to this, whereas comparatively the Chinese are reserved. Would you like to share what the Chinese think about the CPEC?
I mean, I think this dynamic has been true around the relationship in broad terms. On the Pakistani side, there's a level of effusiveness about it that isn't always as fully echoed. You only need to look at the opinion polls. I mean, opinion polls in China are more difficult, but there's a gap in perceptions that exists there and has been there for some time. And there are a lot of concerns, though. I mean, there are concerns in Pakistan as well around CPEC. There's a lot of hope attached to it, and I think there is a level of consensus around its value as a sort of national project. On China's part, I'm not sure they would necessarily have picked Pakistan as the exemplar case for the Belt and Road Scheme. But because that's the case, I think there are a lot more people on the Chinese side who are familiar with this, even familiar with the relationship and familiar with the issues there than there were even 2 years ago, because it's ended up occupying this central role in this in the president's pet scheme. But as I mentioned from the internal assessments, there's still a degree of pessimism about whether they're really going to be able to pull a lot of this off on the Chinese side. I think a lot of the public language that's there around CPEC is very positive. Privately, there's a lot of hesitations. But you have seen, I think, more of an active embrace of the relationship in general in the last year or so, in the context of CPEC than there was in the past. You start having some Chinese strategic thinkers referring in a way that they didn't quite to the same degree in the past, as Pakistan being China's one real ally, the relationship being a model to follow. And again, this puts a degree of pressure on CPEC and what they're able to do for Pakistan in the next case, in the coming period of time. Because I think there is also a dimension that's in play at the moment that China is taking friends and allies more seriously. It wants to show that it can look out for its friends in a way that didn't matter to the same degree before, partly in the context of US-China competition, partly also because as China looks to develop its global power projection capabilities. Because it had its first overseas military base established in the last year. It wants countries that it can count on. And I think this Pakistan relationship, the reason you get this language of it being a model to follow is that I think there is more serious thinking now going on around security partnerships that fall short of military alliances. And Pakistan is in that respect the sort of exemplary case, a country that they can count on for, say, the naval facilities or something like that without even necessarily having to sign a formal treaty or anything to that effect.
I would briefly like to turn to a new subject which you have added in between your first and second, not second edition, but the new edition, that is Afghanistan. You know, I have watched China at international forums for the last 10 years. At the Bonn conference, China was missing, except for the first and the last day, in spite of being a part of the the so-called 6+2 at that time, 2001. They only attended the inaugural session and the concluding session and were not there in the 10 days. And thereafter, at all international meetings from 2009 to 13, they were virtually absent or quiet. Suddenly, towards the end of 2012-13, they started taking some interest. And now, with the US deciding to leave, they became a part of the reconciliation process. Maybe you could share with us something on Afghanistan. And as you know, you have mentioned in your book, China has throughout been in touch with the Taliban. We have seen in the book by the Taliban, the then Taliban ambassador to Pakistan, that the Chinese ambassador was in touch with Mullah Omar even in the late 90s. So not that they have not been in touch, but they've got a more public role only recently. Yes. What would you say to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think you basically had a period in which China sat on its hands on Afghanistan because it had two concerns. It didn't want to see a Taliban victory, but neither did it want to see the US entrench a permanent military presence in what it saw as its backyard. You used to have these Afghan officials would go for meetings with their Chinese counterparts, and they'd pull out these maps and they'd point to the military bases and ask, how long is this going to be here? How long? And this sort of thing. And this was part of the dynamic. And it saw its best solution in that context as just to sit the entire thing out. There were other reasons why it wanted to sit it out too. Once you had the context of the impending US withdrawal, China started to worry that that Afghanistan was going to be left to it to deal with. And I think at that point you had at least a substantially greater level of diplomatic activity on China's part to try to, for the first time, really engage with questions about Afghanistan's long-term future rather than what it had previously done, which was a very narrow set of interests relating to the Uyghur issue, protecting its economic interests, and these sorts of questions. And so I think what you have now and what you've had in the last few years is China really weighing in a more active way on the big picture questions on Afghanistan, including with Pakistan. And I mean, I think part of the role that China sees itself playing on this does relate to its special relationship with Pakistan. I think they bring a few elements to the table on this. The relationship with Pakistan and the degree of leverage that they have there. I think they can put very large-scale resources into the country. If there is some sort of reconciliation there, they see themselves as relatively trusted by a number of the different parties in the country, and that does include the Taliban, where I think they, at a certain point, they'd had a lot of these contacts in secret. They had, of course, the meeting with Mullah Omar, which was known and understood at the time, but they had a period after the US invasion where they maintained their contacts with then the Quetta Shura for a number of years, and some Chinese officials would claim at the time that they were the only country other than Pakistan itself to have maintained continuous contact at the top leadership level with the Taliban. And at a certain point, they started to introduce these contacts as something that could be potential assets for others as well. They raised it in meetings with the Americans and ultimately began the process that led to the quadrilateral where China would look to use its own contacts with the Taliban, but then chiefly look to push Pakistan to bring the Taliban to the table for peace talks. We're now, I think, in a different phase of this with what is virtually the collapse or the sort of non-establishment of a peace process on Afghanistan. And I think now the peace process or a reconciliation process was the sort of sweet spot for China in which a lot of interests converged there. Now it's having to deal more with damage limitation. You see them stepping up their levels of direct support to the Afghan government, including the first provision of military aid in the last little period of time. See a lot of defence delegations going through, including the Chief of Army Staff. And I think there's more of an autonomous relationship being developed with Afghanistan, because for a long time, essentially, China outsourced its Afghanistan policy to Pakistan.
Well, just before coming, you were signing the book for a friend of mine, and I once again looked at the cover, and the subtitle of the book is Asia's New Geopolitics. So a thought that occurred to me as we were talking, as I entered, and I discussed with you, I thought I'll take this as my last question to you. Are you exaggerating Pakistan's role as a part? You know, you have mentioned somewhere in the book that China is key to Pakistan's future. But Pakistan always had a foreign partner as a key to its problem. We have seen Saudi Arabia at one time, we've seen America for a long time. But it's not yet even a regional power. How do you think that it can be a part of a new geopolitics?
So I think some of the developments that have taken place even since the book was finished tended to reinforce this conclusion rather than counteract it. I did not necessarily expect Pakistan to occupy the level of prominence that it has in this westward push on China's part. I think that's happened partly by default. There were reasons that that it might have been expected, but I think in one respect, the degree to which Pakistan has sort of escalated in its salience for Chinese foreign policy, I'm not sure I had even expected it to be the case to that degree. And of course, in the grand scheme of Chinese foreign policy, Pakistan does not occupy a central role. China's primary concerns are still facing in the other direction, in the Asia-Pacific, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the maritime realm, I think, is still more important. There are a whole series of other foreign policy issues that are bigger concerns. But they have been much more serious about the westward push in the last stretch of time. They have been more serious about a whole spectrum of issues that have somehow embroiled Pakistan in them, that include not just these big economic plans, but the salience of counterterrorism for an issue has gone up substantially for China. And again, they find themselves turning to Pakistan both as a partner and as a source of the problem as well. And so there are more roads that have led through Pakistan, both literally and metaphorically for China than I think they had perhaps anticipated, even more so than I had expected. But I think there is a new geopolitics that's playing out that isn't necessarily the China-Pakistan axis in its own right. But I think these broad shifts in the way China is handling the politics in the region, these new geoeconomic initiatives that are underway are really reconditioning the way that the region's politics are being conducted. So this is partly a publisher's title, so I won't defend it relentlessly, but I think there's some kernel of truth in it.
Thank you, Andrew. I think the time that I had set for both of us, we have concluded it in time. And our idea was to give the audience a brief picture of what the book is and the subject. We have a very knowledgeable audience, and I wanted to give time for a conversation between you and them now. So the floor is open, and I will invite questions. I will request everyone to identify themselves and be brief in the questions so that we can cover as many as possible. You were the first to raise your hand, madam. Yes.
I was a bit curious as to why you did not use the trilateral axis, US, Pakistan, and China. Because in the region, whatever is happening in the Southeast Asian strategic issues is as a result of the US involvement in its strategic issues. So why is it that you did not involve, why did not you do a trilateral instead of a bilateral China-Pakistan project, your book? We would have got much more out of you because you are the original.
We'll take a few questions. Yes.
Yeah.
Professor Anita Andersingh, my question is, how does China treat Pakistan's extremist exports, since Pakistani trained extremists can affect both the economic aspect of SPEC as well as the strategic aspect? It seems to be unable or unwilling to do anything about Pakistan's extremists.
One more, yes.
I'm Arvinder Brara, Chairman and Managing Director of Mantech Consultants. My question is about this China-Pakistan axis. What would you suggest as a strategy for the India axis? That's one. Is it Russia, US, and Europe, or what? Number two is, what is the threat of terrorists to Chinese in Pakistan? Is there any incident or concerns on that? Thank you.
You could answer this.
Yeah. So on the, going in reverse order, the threat to Chinese from terrorism in Pakistan, I think you had a peak period that really, the first phase of it was in the early 2000s, the Baluchi insurgency, where a number of Chinese were killed. The next critical phase of it, and that hasn't gone away, the next critical phase of it was after 2007 and the Lal Masjid incident, where China was blamed for having pushed the Pakistani government into taking action in Lal Masjid, and then you had the formation of the Pakistani Taliban that explicitly targeted China at certain points, and you had again a period of time in which a number of Chinese were killed or kidnapped, and I think for a little period of time it was accurate to say that Pakistan was the most dangerous country in the world for Chinese abroad, for Chinese workers. It's actually settled down somewhat in the last few years, or not necessarily settled down in terms of the threat, but the Pakistani security services have done a better job of protecting at least the Chinese projects. But if you, on the Chinese side at the moment, the security threats to the China-Pakistan economic corridor are absolutely central to their concerns. And most of the previous threats have not gone away. The Baluchi threat, the TTP, but then also, you even had an attack from what does appear to have been a Sindhi group in Karachi, which is the only even semi-successful attack that there's been in the last period of time. But China is an obvious target now and has been for the last stretch if you want to hit the Pakistani government as well in a very sensitive way. China will react. I think China will be willing to press ahead with the project, assuming a certain low level of attacks taking place, even successful ones. But there is a level of violence there. There is a level of attacks that I don't think they would be prepared to live with. It's a very high point of sensitivity. So I think that threat is undoubtedly there and probably China's most serious concern. I think this next phase of what China is doing is, the security dimensions of the rivalry will continue. China will continue to bolster various of Pakistan's military capabilities. The naval phase may be part of the next one, even on the nuclear side. There are various of the new capabilities. Pakistan using armed drones for the first time of Chinese lineage. I think you've seen China, even the miniaturization of nukes for the battlefield nukes. I think China was... you can point to China for that as well. I think there is a form of security cooperation that is going to be there and that will feed into a rivalry that takes place with India. But I think a lot of these developments are a more mixed bag. The economic corridor, for instance, I think there are obvious reasons to object for diplomatic reasons. Certain of the projects taking place in disputed territory, Gwadar and what its ramifications are. But there are potential benefits as well to a more economically stable Pakistan if the project actually succeeds. There are some benefits to a greater level of restraint if China is willing to push it on Pakistan when it comes to its behavior in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So there are some of the dimensions in terms of the way that the relationship is moving at the moment that are a more mixed picture for Indian interests, I think. So I'm not necessarily... I think the logic of the India-US relationship may look at China, but doesn't necessarily look at... and has so many elements that go beyond China as well, but doesn't necessarily need to look centrally at what China and Pakistan are doing. And of course, I think for a number of, on the US side, I think there's a level of modest support for what China is doing with CPEC, at least important elements of the project. So I think it's hard to find an alignment with another country that's specifically directed against some of what's going on the China-Pakistan front. But I think there's more important things to be done than that strategically in any case for India. On the how China deals with extremist exports question, there are limited areas where China is willing to be helpful. I mean, China still protects various of these groups at the UN Security Council, in the Sanctions Committee, appoints Lashkar-e Taiba, various others there. So it's still effectively a political protector for Pakistan on that front. I think they give broad brush sort of encouragement for Pakistan to settle some of these issues, but nothing in practical terms. The area where I think there has been more pressure has been on the Afghanistan-facing front, where I think there has been more of a push on their part there to limit their ambitions for what the Taliban's future role is, for instance. And then they have been, with the Pakistani army operation in North Waziristan, China was very actively encouraging of that because they wanted to see the groups that they're concerned about, the Turkestan Islamic Party and some others, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, hit in North Waziristan. And so there are areas where they directly push the Pakistanis when they're groups that are specifically antithetical to China. There are areas where I think they've pushed Pakistan to show some restraint on their use of these groups. And then there are other areas where they do either absolutely nothing or actively facilitate what Pakistan is doing. And I think there's a huge degree of separation between, depending on which specific group one is talking about. On the Pakistan-China axis and the US, I think the US, I mean, the book, the other two countries that exist in central roles in the book are the United States and India. I mean, there's the relationship that's in play between China and Pakistan on this. These are always the other powers that are in play, and a large portion of the book is focused on how the US sees it, the US dimension of this relationship. But the China-Pakistan relationship itself has particular features of interest, and I thought merited a devoted treatment in its own right, rather than just a look at the broader geopolitical dimensions in the region. When I started working on this book, it was partly because there still hadn't been a single-authored treatment of at least some kind of a history of the relationship for a few decades. I mean, there were some multi-author treatments and things, but I think it's an important relationship in its own right, and merited some focused attention. But the US dimension is extremely important, and I covered quite a lot as well.
Ambassador Showkat, I was going to in any case ask him. He was still recently around. I'm glad he has wanted to show.
Thanks, sir. First of all, I would like to compliment you, Andrew, for your excellent book. I benefited immensely from your book. I wanted to raise 3 issues, if you permit, sir. One, as you have highlighted in your book and your subsequent writings, Chinese involvement in CPEC marks a new dimension in Sino-Pak relations. In a way, China is seeking to bolster stability and development of Pakistan. CPEC, as you mentioned, has also acquired a very high profile in Belt and Road Initiative. It's sort of flagship project of both continental and maritime components of Belt and Road Initiative. A corollary to that, much is riding on success of CPEC. This will also involve China getting more involved in domestic affairs of Pakistan, as you have mentioned in your book and subsequent writings. I would like to hear from you whether this will affect the basic strategic trust, very high level of trust that exists between China and Pakistan. Will it create strains in relations between two countries? Will it affect the perception of all-weather friendship that exists particularly in Pakistan vis-a-vis China? This is one question. Second question I wanted to raise is with regard to security dimension of relationship, which remains, to our mind, the most important component of strategic relationship between China and Pakistan. You have mentioned earlier about China getting involved in developing a sea leg of Pakistan's nuclear triad. We are aware of China's decision to provide 8 submarines to Pakistan, 4 of which will be fabricated in Karachi. I would like to hear more from you about this aspect, which would be of obvious interest to us. Third issue I wanted to raise is about something you alluded to, China's decision last year to acquire its first overseas base or support facility, as they call it, at Djibouti. There have been speculation that this is just first of its kind, that this template will be deployed elsewhere. US DOD in its last report has specifically referred to Gwadar as a candidate for China acquiring at least preferential access for its navy. Here again, I would like to hear your views.
Yeah, absolutely. So starting with the first question, very interesting questions, Ambassador. In theory, CPEC is supposed to be a sort of bolstering device for the relationship, but exactly as you suggest, I think there's a lot of risks for the relationship that ensue from it. I think the China-Pakistan relationship had been managed essentially by a pretty small cast of people on both sides for a long time. China was a sort of stepped back backdrop supporter. Now it's really embroiled in the day-to-day political life, economic life, in a way that it had not been before. And I think you already see with some of the infighting that's taking place around the corridor, the degree to which that exposes China to some different risks that were not there before. China has essentially benefited from the fact that it has support from all of the major political parties, has public opinion ratings in Pakistan that are unlike any other that it has in any other country in the world, plus 80%. There have even been some approval ratings at 90% and things like this. I don't believe that this degree of national consensus will survive at that level with China as immersed as they're going to be in the next stretch of time in all of the roles that they're going to play in the political battles that are there in Pakistan, and just in the day-to-day interactions that are there as well. I think it's resilient enough, precisely, as you say, because the security aspect is so central. I don't necessarily think this will fundamentally counteract the fact that the alignment is still there, the cooperation is deep, long-standing, and will continue. But it will leave China exposed in a way that, I mean, they already are now in a very different status in Pakistani day-to-day debates in a way that they were not 18 months ago. And so I do expect that's going to be a risk for them. The other element of the risk is that they are more dependent to be able to realize these plans on regional stability than they were. And the India-centric framework for the relationship has been one of a very high degree of alignment between the two sides. When they start addressing issues of terrorism, internal stability, Afghanistan, and these sorts of questions, I think it puts, these are issues where the two sides do not have the same degree of affinity, and there are differences between them on these issues, and I think some of them are likely to come to the fore more as a result of the level of commitments of investment that China has as a result of CPEC. I still don't. I think the relationship as a whole now is on an upswing. I think China is attaching more strategic salience to it and all of these things. But I think at the political level and in a number of these new fronts that are opening up, I think you have a slightly different set of pressures that haven't been there in the relationship before. On the third question. Djibouti and Gwadar, yes, I think it's the first of what will be a number of facilities that China establishes. And when you look at the PLA Navy's assessments of these things, of the kind of tiers of potential bases, Pakistan had occupied the sort of highest potential tier because of the political and military relationship between the two countries in terms of what their expectations were in terms of what a facility could be reliably used for. The difference in Pakistan's case, of course, is as well that they needn't even call it a base or something there. They can have a set of understandings there that needn't involve the sorts of formal agreements that have been put in place in the Djibouti case. Whether it's Gwadar or not, I think is still an open question. I think if they're able to make the port functional in ways that mean that it can actually be used for normal purposes by the PLA Navy, then I think they would like Gwadar to be the facility that they use. And the commercial development of the port and making it at least, having a water supply that is reliable, and a number of the problems that Gwadar has at the moment, at least being able to fix some of these things would then make it substantially more useful. In the meantime, I think China's happy to use Karachi, and they're not absolutely hung up on it being Gwadar that's the focal point. The naval nuclear side, I think this. I'd hesitate to answer that at such length. I think it is an important and interesting question you raised. In normal circumstances, had you not had CPEC, I think people would have been paying a lot of attention to that submarine deal, one of the biggest arms sales in theory in Chinese history. And I think there will be an eye in the next stretch on how quickly and the nature of whether Pakistan is, as they have said they intend to be, able to develop the sea leg of the nuclear triad. And I think China will be integrally involved in it, as they have in almost every other phase of Pakistan's nuclear weapons capabilities. But pinning down the details on that is, as it has been for a lot of the last stretch, extraordinarily difficult, and I don't presume to say the precise form that it will take. I think there have been points at which it's been clear on some specific details where China's helped with targeting mechanisms or miniaturization and a few other areas. On the naval side, I would hesitate to say precisely where it is they're going to step in beyond this specific support on the submarines.
The three next questions on my, one moment. The two generals and diplomats, so please.
Thank you very much. This is not a general question, but one on Pakistan and one on Afghanistan. I am General Mehta and I do work on India-Pakistan convene and also on Afghanistan. Now, somewhere in your book, you've said that keeping India down is really the glue of the China-Pakistan axis. You also say somewhere that the relationship is not unconditional. In other words, this is not a one-way road. And the third aspect is, and I'm just making these till I come to my question, the third aspect is that Pakistan is China's only ally. Its only big ally. I would think it's the only ally. Don't the Chinese get embarrassed by its strategic choice of an ally? Because everything, everywhere, you've had an attack, axe attack on a train in Berlin, and it's a Pakistani. If something is there in Greece, it's a Pakistan, somebody of Pakistani origin. So what is it that Pakistan does for China other than India, keeping India down? Because I don't see anything greater than that on the periphery. On Afghanistan, my question relates to the fact that in your book you talk about how the Chinese were in contact with the Taliban in the 90s, and as the chair mentioned, the meeting with Mullah Umar. But in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that they were included in the quadrilateral, their influence over Pakistan, this double influence, the Quad failed. And if I can add a small bit, because in my view, till the Chinese put boots on the ground, in their policy on Afghanistan some time ago, it used to be qualified with 3 no's. No criticism of UN, no boots on the ground, no use of the Northern Distribution Network, and there was one more which I have forgotten. So if a country cannot be strategically important unless it's prepared to put boots on the ground, so I can't see how China, ostensibly having a lever over Pakistan and also some influence over Taliban, has turned out to be a cropper as far as the peace and reconciliation process is concerned. Thank you.
I'm Jana Devraj. I read your book with great interest. It's an excellent book.
Thank you.
I think the first of its kind, which really retains all aspects of the Axis. My first question is regarding the nuclear weapons. The whole world worries about Pakistan's nuclear weapons, particularly their fallout or they're falling into the wrong hands. Doesn't China worry about that? And if it worries, then what explains its continued help in the same field and missiles to Pakistan? Either he doesn't worry, it looks very happy. And second thing is that I do feel that one of the main aims besides India of China in Pakistan is to keep all other powers away from Pakistan. it wants a monopoly of influence in Pakistan, just like North Korea on the other side, where it doesn't want any other influence. It has to tolerate the Russian influence there to some extent. It can't do anything about it. I have a feeling that they want the same thing because on their periphery, historically, China doesn't want any hostile nation, barbarians or whatever. And third question is, how do the Russians see this excess? How does it affect their interest and how do they perceive it? These are 3 questions. Thank you.
A short question. First, compliments to you, Mr. Small, for a pioneering effort as a first scholarly study on a subject which should be of wider interest even outside the region, but has not been written about much as a study. But by the same token, you have touched upon, not only touched upon, expanded on various sensitive and delicate aspects of the relationship, which possibly the two countries, the two protagonists would not like to be talked about openly in the open realm. You must have interacted in both countries in the last year and a half since the book came out. What is the feedback? What kind of comments have you received from the think tanks and official circles in these two countries? I'm curious to hear about that. Thank you.
For sure. All right. Thanks for all of the very interesting questions. On the last question, I think it has, because there hasn't been a kind of piecing together of a lot of this material before in this way, I think on both the Chinese side and the Pakistani side, there are quite a lot of people who have actually just found it useful to have all of this stuff put in one place. So in terms of people's interest in reading the thing, it was, I think people found some value in having the thing put together. In terms of the reception of the book in the two places, I think on the Chinese side, they were more uncomfortable about the fact that a lot of this material was put out. I think habitually they are more uncomfortable about this sort of material being put out in public. But I mean, on the Pakistani side, I think it was seen as, there were lots of things they didn't like about it, but it was seen as relatively objective, not overtly hostile, kind of relatively fair-minded in its treatment. So although I kind of got readouts from people about the bits that they didn't like and things like this, and of course they hate the title, to take an obvious reference point. But for the most part, I think it was seen as kind of fair cop on a lot of the things that were being claimed. So I wasn't actually sure in some of the cases how straightforward it would be to go back to various countries and interact with a lot of the people I'd interacted with before. It doesn't seem to have affected that. So sort of cautious sort of reception, but not completely problematic. On the other questions, I think this assessment that if China was really worried about nuclear weapons falling into the wrong hands, then they wouldn't provide the level of support that they do, including on the tactical nuclear side in particular. And they speak now more openly about, they raise some of these concerns in theory in meetings that they have, and they have done this. Continue to cooperate in the way that they do does reflect a level of confidence that's there on the issue, and I think you could probably read different behaviour from them if they didn't have that level of confidence. So whether they're correct in that confidence is another question, but I generally find that it's there. There are political conditions where that might look different, but as things stand, I mean, you get this line: we're sure that they'll protect their nuclear weapons. It's the only thing they really have, and this sort of stuff. So I think they do seem to have this level of confidence there. On the Are they? I'm not necessarily. I think there is a different case for Pakistan than, for instance, North Korea. I think in the case of Pakistan, they have actually wanted, for instance, Pakistan to have a good relationship with the United States. And this has been put to the test, of course, in a number of different scenarios. They've wanted Pakistan to benefit from its ties to the US and to the West and to other countries, because I think they see this external support, including weapons sales and things, as bolstering Pakistan's capacities vis-a-vis India, vis-a-vis their own, the scope for them to benefit from some of the technologies as well. And I think that's been a pretty consistent pattern. And as well that when Pakistan is in an isolated position, it puts additional pressure on them and on the relationship. And the periods of time in which Pakistan has been more out of favour, I think they found more of a squeeze on them and what they're doing with the Pakistanis. Whereas when Pakistan-US relations are somewhat better, that pressure effectively goes away. They were uncomfortable in the aftermath of 9/11 about the degree of US involvement that you suddenly saw in the country, for instance, but there are parameters of the relationship that I think they still want to see with the US, and that they will now. And you have had it tested in cases, I mean, the aftermath of Abbottabad was one of the clearest cases where they really were kind of coming into Beijing and saying, you know, can we really deepen the defense relationship and in a way that at that juncture would have looked very much directed at the US. And you had, and the Chinese were during that phase very careful to brief the Americans on the fact that they were not going to be given this backing at that sort of sensitive moment, and that they were advising them to improve their relations with the Americans. And so I think it operates in a slightly different context. I think they get most of what they want out of the relationship as things stand anyway, without necessarily having to deepen it further or keep other powers out. And I'll come back to the Russia one, but this does lead, I think, into what they think they get out of Pakistan, other than the India piece, and the India piece is of course absolutely central. I think there have been a number of other roles that Pakistan has played for China over the years. I think it had this kind of, because it's being a trusted partner meant that it could play this bridging role. Of course, the US-China relationship itself being sort of discreetly brokered, relations with Saudi Arabia being discreetly brokered, relations with the Taliban, and that then leads into the other element of it, where I think China has looked to Pakistan to navigate its relationships with extremist groups, and they have occupied that role less successfully from China's perspective in the period, particularly since 2007, 2008. But I think that's been a central thing that they have looked to them to do, to ensure that militant groups in the region don't target China, don't provide support to Uyghur organizations, and that they continue to look to Pakistan to play that role. And I think they actually have a less problematic situation when it comes to how militant groups think about China and the way that they behave in Xinjiang and the way that they treat their own Muslim population as a result of that. So I do think they continue to believe that they benefit from this. And now you have this kind of new equation as well on the economic side to a certain extent, and the corridor and some of these questions. But I think if you took India out of the picture, it would look very thin. It would, and I don't think you'd have had the relationship that you've had between the two sides. And I think the word embarrassed may be a little strong, but sheepish was the word that I would use about it. But I think that's absolutely, the case. Lastly, on the Russia question, but lastly on the Quad and some of these things, yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think the whole thing. I think there were hopes that China had, there were hopes that the US had of China and others had of China to be able to help deliver Pakistan. China had hopes of Pakistan that they would deliver the Taliban. Pakistan may have had hopes of certain figures in the Taliban to be able to deliver as well. All of them have obviously. And the last piece of the equation is obviously where the question mark is. And this does come down to who is willing to exert what level of the leverage that I think they at each level do have. I think China could push Pakistan harder on this, and of course Pakistan could push the Taliban substantially harder on this. I'm not sure China's fully confident enough in its judgments about the handling of the Taliban to be able to do that. I don't think it's that the leverage doesn't exist. I think they've been heavily dependent on the Pakistanis for their assessments of these groups and how they're operating. I think if the Pakistanis go to them and say, we can't do this, or we need more time, or the conditions aren't right, I don't think they have the confidence to be able to turn around and say, you're just playing us. I think over time they do want to develop the capacity to make those judgments. I think one of the lessons I think they've taken in the last period of time is that they have been too heavily dependent on the Pakistanis for these things. I think this is part of why they are developing this closer intelligence and military relationship with Afghanistan at the moment as well. I think I'm not sure that they consider the position that they're in entirely helpful. They're training more people up in the language skills. They're doing a lot more work on this. I think they've been very weak in their capacities in this entire region. And I mean, when you talk to any of the people that have been dealing with the Taliban on the Chinese side, it's a huge. I mean, they really don't have a feel for it. When you get the readouts of these meetings, they're extremely uncomfortable with dealing with these things, and even after all of the contacts that have been there, I don't think they have a comfort zone on this to be able to make the judgments on it. But yes, I think it's a completely different zone now after this. The effort on the Quad has failed, and I think China's really trying to figure out what to do if the reconciliation process thing is dead, as I think they fear it may be indefinitely.
Well, normally I would have concluded with your sheepish comment, but I've got only two questions. One, Mr. Jayad and the senior watcher, old-time watcher of China. I have two more questions because time is already. Please be brief with your comment. You've been asking right from the beginning. Sorry, I couldn't take it earlier.
No, thank you very much. The first question is China's hesitation or limitations in the past on the relationship due to concerns on Pakistani ambitions vis-a-vis India, or more to a desire that Pakistan, like China, learn to be patient and force confrontations after the first developing capabilities?
Neelam, you want to ask something quickly, and then I'll come to the. We're all China watchers, so.
I would very much share the chair's observation that the title could seem a bit exaggerated, I think, if one saw it last year. No, wait a minute. I think with the benefit of the epilogue in the updated version, I think we should compliment your publishers. It's more than justified, especially what comes out, what we felt and were sensing for a long time, but you have so meticulously documented in the updated version. If Pakistan is going to be the centerpiece of China's, this great obor, the flagship, that's going to in fact be the flagship project for Xi Jinping's one Belt, One Road. It's going to be the key to China positioning itself in Afghanistan. It's going to be very vital in actually getting at tackling the root of fundamentalism, both in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, ultimately Xinjiang, and as always, to contain India. And ultimately, the circle of influence that it wants to carve out as a kind of its response to the US rebalancing, that whole Eurasia and spanning so many continents. So I would think, actually, it would justify, I think, as even though it is being for the present shaped by other big players, I think compliments to you and your publisher for that. Now, this role would require for China a Pakistan at peace with its neighbors. And I, for one, have believed, and I think probably you've also observed it, that it's not necessarily economic returns that China has sought from Pakistan. It's more the security and the strategic results. But this time, since you need this kind of a peaceful environment and for this whole scheme to fall into place, it has to be at peace with the neighbors. So then India has to be one of the deliverables. So my question is, how will then China balance its so managed mistrust, or basically what we call, its use of Pakistan as a force multiplier against India, and this role as making the whole economic corridor a big success. That is where that's where the whole program will succeed. And lastly, very quickly, this entire economic takeover of Pakistan, when they say it's not just a corridor, but the whole country, it's a very new, even for China. I think one would really like to know how that's going to play out and how that will be received ultimately. Thank you.
Well, the last word from the audience. Oh, I'm glad it's yours.
My name is Ravi Bhuthalingam. My background has been in business and industry, and I'm also connected with China studies. I have two questions. One is on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The impression in India has been largely negative about the CPEC, as you might gather. But I think, as you indicated a little earlier, India could benefit greatly by linking into the CPEC, using your concept of managed mistrust. Because I cannot see the CPEC depending on the Pakistani hinterland for any economic returns. The CPEC has to link either eastwards to the Indian market and possibly westwards to the Iranian market for it to generate anything. And China is today very, very wary about committing large-scale capital expenditure. In fact, they're shutting down overcapacity in China. They are conscious that they've thrown a lot of bad capital within China, and I don't know whether they will repeat this overseas. And therefore, I'd like to ask you whether in your book you have covered the positives of the CPEC vis-a-vis India, and for India to benefit economically whilst managing the political mistrust with Pakistan. My second question is on Gwadar, which seems to play a large role in the proceedings. But Gwadar earlier was run by the Singaporeans. They got quite fed up and they left. From the conversations I've had, no international shipping line anywhere in the world has expressed any interest in Gwadar. They have expressed interest in Chabahar. They have expressed interest in Bandar Abbas. You haven't mentioned Iran, which is a big player in the game and has recently come into the news. The road and belt is going to play heavily into Iran. The Chinese are forecasting 600 billion of trade in 10 years with Iran. Even if you get a quarter of that, it's a big number. So how is Iran going to alter this whole scenario? That's my second question. Thank you.
I'm going to request Andrew to briefly conclude. And my concluding sentence is that it has been a rare opportunity to discuss an opportunistic alliance. Now, I'll ask you to complete it because the time is short, that's why. Please.
Thank you, Ambassador. So the India piece on CPEC is interesting. I don't think it has been fully broached yet, but I completely agree with your analysis. I think the point at which CPEC actually becomes genuinely economically useful and could genuinely function as a transit corridor is if Pakistan actually functions as a hub in the region. And the only way it can meaningfully function as a hub is really if the India piece of it shifts. And I think a certain number of years down the line, I would not be surprised to see push from the Chinese side in that direction. I don't think it's there at all at the moment. I accept that it's not present, but I think the really successful realization of the scheme further down the line is not just going to be internal to Pakistan. Afghanistan is in the realistic short to medium term is not going to make a meaningful difference to it. Iran, I think when talking to people on the Iranian side, I think their inclination still is that Central Asia is a better and more reliable form of connectivity to China, particularly since you have the existing pipeline network and this sort of thing, than Pakistan. I mean, they may connect to Pakistan for Iran-Pakistan related regions, but for the China piece of it, I still suspect it will be the Central Asia piece that is more useful for them, aside from the maritime piece. And yes, I think Iran in principle is one of the other countries. When Xi Jinping made the visit to Iran earlier this year, I was very curious to see whether you got a dollar sum that was comparable to CPEC or something like that. You got this figure that you mentioned, this 600 billion trade figure that seems like, on any arithmetic on present trade numbers and the size of the economy, unimaginable. But I think Iran should be one of the other places where they could actually press ahead with large-scale investment in the sums of tens of billions of dollars. But I think the India piece of it will come into it more importantly further down the line. I think China will start poking on that front, but not yet. On the let me do the other two together. The Pakistan, I think China has seen Pakistan as operating sort of unpredictably. They haven't trusted. They've seen them as a bit adventurous, a bit capricious on these things, and that's been where this kind of desire for something that looks more like managed mistrust looks like, and why there's still a level of caution about. And the caution has extended in concrete situations. It's not just been a sort of backdrop of trepidation about what Pakistan will do. In these specific scenarios, China has said in Kargil, pull your troops back, and things like this. So I think in the context in which Pakistan takes measures that China thinks are ill-judged, it's quite clear about saying so, and that has conditioned how it's seen the relationship as well, and the potential liabilities that are there on the Pakistani side. And this does really play into the other question, which is about how the degree to which China does actually need regional stability to pull this off. If you watch the footage of Xi Jinping's visit and Nawaz Sharif's speech, you see one of the points in which he's reading the speech, in which he specifically makes this statement about at peace with its neighbours, and sort of looks over at Xi Jinping the whole time that he's reading the statement. And I mean, I was, in the lead up to the Xi Jinping visit, this was one of the strong messages that the Chinese were giving to the Pakistanis. They have consistently given this message in certain respects. They intensified that message in the run-up to Xi's visit. Be at peace with your neighbours, don't do anything stupid. And that played out that referred specifically to India, Afghanistan, and then in the lead up to the Xi visit, Iran as well, because there was the question of Pakistan's participation in the operation in Yemen, which would therefore have put them in potential conflict with the Iranians. And so I think that message and that question of restraint is really going to be there from the Chinese side. There are developments and actions that Pakistan could take that would be now far more antithetical to China's interests than they were when China was more removed from this. It's got more skin in the game in Pakistan and in terms of what these projects look like, and I think there's less comfort level than there used to be to just allowing some of these episodes to play out in the way that they used to. I think that was everything.
Thank you.